Start here just a couple of bits of sort of bookkeeping. If everyone could turn their cameras off once Becca starts talking, that helps make sure we all have a good connection throughout. The chat is open, so feel free to put questions in there during the talk. Becca will pause at least once to look at questions in the middle, as well as at the end. And then this is always hard to synchronize on Zoom, but I hope at the end we can manage to all unmute at the same time and give her a nice round of applause, because that's one of the things that's always missing when we do this in this setting. Okay, so Becca, if you could go to the next slide. So what we were going for in this picture was Abbey Road. It looks a little bit more like a prison chain gang in some ways. And I think in the case of a lot of dissertations, probably the better choice of a Beatles song might be The Long and Winding Road. But with Becca, the entire thing has been an absolute joy. This is really my great pleasure to introduce her today. And a lot of you know this, but I'll just mention that I actually taught Becca in her very first Earth Science class here. So it's very fitting about 7 years later, to be introducing her to defend her dissertation. So when Becca first took the class, formerly known as Intro to Environmental Geology, she was a communications major at the time who was looking at basically just filling out a science requirement. And we very quickly pulled her over to the dark side. And she's been here ever since, although as I'll say at the end, she has re-embraced the communications side as well. So if I could do the next slide. So it's been my great fortune over the time that Becca has been with the lab to have worked with a really amazing group of scientists. And, labs sort of go through eras. So, and they're sort of dominated by the personalities of the people that are there. And so because Becca has been here for the last 7 years, along with Katie, who's on the call today, Becca Stein, Mel Shaddix, as graduate students, she's really been kind of the continuous thing throughout all this. And out of all the graduate students I've worked with going back to 2004, Becca is, I would say, is probably the single one I've looked the most forward to our meetings when we were going to offices, when we had offices. And it was partly because she is an overwhelmingly positive person, but she would come with ideas every single time, more ideas than we could get done. And in fact, what you're going to see today in terms of her thesis is really just a snippet of the work that she's done in terms of her research. And I could tell you about the other papers she's written, all those kinds of things. But instead, I'd like to talk a little bit about, if we could have the next slide, her unique fashion sense. And so Becca has really single-handedly tried to keep the socks and sandals look alive. And so you can see her here, in spite of the fact that we're on an incredibly muddy road where it's raining, that, still rocking the socks and sandals. And a lot of you will know the old cliche that the longer a couple is together, the more and more they come to look like one another. And so to that, I present you with Becca and Nick in this picture here. But being serious, a lot of, we've been in the field in a number of different places in the lab and all the rest, and we've had a lot of really kind of amazing experiences doing different things. And I think my favorite trip with Becca was one where we went to the Faroes. And I unfortunately didn't find the best picture of the Faroes, where she's just covered in mud and rain and sheep and everything else. But a couple of things from that story. One of the things that I learned was that there may be no person on earth who likes chocolate more than Becca. So we would buy chocolate by the kilogram. And I was in the passenger seat and Becca was driving. And so I, had my backpack on my feet. And each time we stopped, Becca would go back and get her backpack out of the trunk. And so about noon on the first day, I went back and I thought, yeah, I could use a little bit of chocolate. And I looked, and I'm not kidding, there was like a kilogram of chocolate missing already. So I realized each time she was going back to the trunk, that's what she was going for. But the other thing that we shared on that trip, which this is one of those experiences I sort of recommend, but not really, is that in the Faroes, the islands are actually connected by underground or underwater tunnels that go beneath the fjords. And so to get to the northernmost island that we had to go into something I've never seen anywhere else in the world, which was a one-way tunnel underneath the fjord that went on for something like 7 miles. And so you basically had to trust that everyone's headlights worked and that and that everyone knew when it was their turn to move over. But at the end of it, we rewarded ourselves with a piece of carrot cake that was about the size of a sheep as well. And so I'll always remember that trip for lots of reasons, both talking about science and not science as well. If I could have the next one. But I think even more so than Becca's science contributions, I think really she's just been a part of the fabric, not just of my research group, but of the entire department. I'm not sure there's anyone in the department that doesn't know Becca in some setting or another. She's worked as part of the Geo Club over a variety of years. She's been a GSM, so mentoring other graduate students over the last couple of years. The picture on the left of the screen here is with Emily Beverly, one of our excellent former postdocs who's now a professor at University of Houston. They were doing fieldwork together. The picture on the right here is Becca along with 3 of her undergraduate advisees, all of whom have gone on to do really awesome things. But in particular, Sonia Vogel with the red hair in the front and Katie Seguin with the brown hair on the left side there, both did honors theses during the pandemic. And they did it under really significant guidance from Becca. And she put a lot of time, not just into getting herself to her goals, but also to getting all of these other students to where they wanted to go. And so I think she's been an amazing influence on so many people. So if I could have the next slide, please. But one of the things that happened for a lot of us during the pandemic is we had a chance to pause and to think about what it was that we wanted to do. And for Becca, this had been sort of growing for a little while, but the desire to get back into communications and to start thinking about how science could be brought to people in an informed way, but also in a way that would help people to understand the complex things, led her back to that communications place where she started. So in many ways, Becca has come full circle with an earth science PhD here to be in the middle. And so Becca has spent this last year as GSA's Science Communications Fellow. When I was talking to the guy who runs the program, he mentioned something to me which I found really striking, but which is really, I think, a credit to Becca, which was that she's actually the first scientist to hold this role. This has typically been held by journalists, and yet she was able to write in an accessible and successful enough way that they brought her in as the first scientist. And I hope that she's sort of set the bar in a really high place. And in doing this writing, one of the things that Becca did was that she really highlighted not just scientific achievement, but also the ways in which our community could do better. And she highlighted issues of accessibility. She highlighted issues of LGBTQ students and everything else. And this really has been a theme through a number of the things that she's done. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple of pieces of her non-research writing here, just to say that not only has she taken on this challenge of changing careers and really thinking about her things in a different direction, but that she's also been incredibly successful. And so this piece up here in the upper left-hand corner is one of the ones about thinking about ableism and field requirement and whether or not the stereotype of an earth scientist looks like me, bearded white guy of a certain age, who climbs up and down mountains in an Indiana Jones sort of way is really the science that we want it to be. And this piece was picked up widely and continues to be circulated. And then the 2 other ones that are on here are really show the breadth of what Becca can do as a scientist, in that she's able to talk about a variety of different kinds of things. And so the top one of these, the one here in the middle, this Using Soil to Make Art, is a piece that was in Smithsonian Magazine that really looks at that intersection between science and art. And then there's also this other piece over here, also from Smithsonian Magazine, looking at things like sustainability. So she was able to cover an incredibly broad array of different topics because she had the expertise and the ability to do that. So I think I've probably gilded the lily enough at this point, but it is my great pleasure to introduce to all of you Becca Dzombak for her dissertation defense.
Thanks, Nathan, for that glowing review of my time with you and in the department. I also really enjoyed our meetings, and I'll say this more in the acknowledgements, but with Nathan, I always felt like I was coming into our meetings, especially later on, more of a colleague. Like I felt he made it very easy for me to bring those ideas where it was like, I was thinking about this last night and is it completely crazy? And he's like, no, we can explore it. So I really appreciated that. Before we get going, I want to just highlight that if you would like to enable subtitles for this talk, you should have that capability by navigating to this button in Zoom and just clicking Show Subtitles. I also want to say people especially maybe members of the public, so friends and family who are here, I feel like there's often this perception that this is a really intimidating environment to ask questions. But I just want to highlight that this is a talk for the public. So I really encourage people to put questions in the chat as we go. As Nathan said, I'm going to try and pause it a couple of times and check to see if there are questions that I can offer some quick clarifications on or quick follow-ups. And if there are longer questions that people put in, I'll probably address them at the end, as usual. And Nathan sort of stole my intro a little bit. He was my first professor in geology. And I walked into the classroom and I saw all the flannels and Birkenstocks and I was like, yes, I'm home. This feels right. But I didn't know at the time that he would end up being my advisor. And so, flash forward a couple of years and to when I'm sitting in his office and we're talking about what I can do for grad school. And I was considering a couple of places, obviously including Michigan. And he was sitting there, telling me all about his research, which focuses on the Precambrian, which is, hundreds of millions and even billions of years old, and how much he cared about this weathering process. And I was more or less politely nodding along, like, oh, okay, good, like you really care about this. But in my head, there was a part of me that was like, okay, like billions of years, how much can we really know about that? And like this weathering, how important can it really be? Well, after I submitted my dissertation, I plugged it into a word cloud generator. And weathering turned out to be very important for me, as it was revealed sort of slowly over the years to me as I learned more about what weathering is and all of the ways that it affects many different Earth systems. And my understanding really started, my understanding of weathering really started with just the basic definition, which is that weathering is the combination of physical and chemical processes that breaks down rocks, into smaller rocks, and it transforms minerals and chemical compositions over time. So that's all well and good, but as an undergrad, I was like, well, okay, but how does that, control oxygen? Well, as I went through grad school, I didn't set out to study questions about weathering, but it kept cropping back up. And so I was just sort of funneled into studying it. And this is for a couple of reasons. So beyond just sort of breaking big rocks into smaller rocks, weathering does two really important services, basically, that I'm going to focus on today. And those are breaking down bedrock and in that process, releasing essential nutrients that are currently locked up in that bedrock. And so when that bedrock is weathered, those nutrients are mobilized and released into the biosphere so that plants and animals, including us, can use them. And the other sort of product of weathering that I'm going to focus on is this process of soil formation. So as that bedrock is weathered, things aren't typically immediately just sort of washed away. They have time to build up and accumulate on the surface. And soil is important because, and unique, because it forms right at Earth's surface, where it's constantly interacting with the atmosphere and the climate, the organisms that are living on top of it and even within it, as well as the water and fluids moving underground and the rock that it forms on, as well as the topography that's surrounding it. And all of these factors vary over time and space, and unique combinations make unique soils. And one critical part of this process is the fact that as all of these factors are sort of defining the soil, they're also recorded in the physical and chemical composition of that soil. So that's a key point. So just tuck that bit of information away. And because we have such great variability in these factors, think about driving across the country, we have really different ecosystems, and Wyoming isn't quite as flat as Michigan. And so these changes result in a huge variety of soils, both, again, in terms of how they look physically and their chemical composition. And this variability is, of course, driven by a range of factors. One of the key ones is really the degree of weathering intensity that they've undergone. So here, just to demonstrate, on the left, I have a relatively young soil that hasn't been intensely weathered. It may have, lower nutrient concentration because it hasn't had time to accumulate that, really. And then as we move to the right, we pass through soils that are in sort of a happy middle age. They're thriving, they've got tons of nutrients, their biospheres are super happy. And then all the way over to the right, we have a more intensely weathered soil that might be more depleted in nutrients, and just later on in its sort of life cycle. And so for all soils, after they've had some time to sit at Earth's surface and store and recycle those nutrients and support a biosphere, they eventually get eroded away. And this just refers to the process of wind and rivers and rain and gravity moving sediments and soils away from where they were originally deposited and redistributing them around landscapes. And eventually, they tend to be deposited in basins, like if we think about the Great Basin out west, big lakes would count as basin, and the ocean as well. And in the geologic timescales that we're going to be focusing on today, I really want you to think about deposition in an ocean basin as sort of the final resting place for these sediments. And we can refer to this general process of sediments being transported from where they started to where they finish in the basin as moving from the sediment source or the sediment supply on land to the sediment sink. And again, these are just some terms that I'll use throughout the talk and return to this concept of moving from the source to the sink, as well as the different ways that we can use these different sort of reservoirs to explore Earth's history. And in addition to just thinking about how sediments are moved during this process, how sand is moved around when it forms dunes or coastal evolution, we also want to consider how nutrients move through this cycle and how nutrients are redistributed around landscapes. And one of the most important elements that we can consider, and one of the elements that I focused on in my dissertation work, is phosphorus. And I just focus on phosphorus because it is a limiting and essential nutrient in a lot of ecosystems today, which is why, for example, we add it to our backyard gardens and to our farms to stimulate crop growth. And it's also why when those same agricultural soils are eroded away into, say, nearby Lake Erie, we get a huge burst of productivity. The algae are really happy because phosphorus is this scarce resource that basically how much phosphorus you have sets the maximum amount of primary productivity or photosynthesis that can occur in that ecosystem. And we also think that it was a limiting nutrient through geologic time as well. And so we understand the modern phosphorus cycle pretty well. This is a quite simplified version. Really here I'm just showing that phosphorus undergoes that same cycle that we just walked through, where it's liberated from the bedrock, hangs around in soil for a while it's used by the biosphere, and then eventually gets eroded and deposited into an ocean basin where, just like in Lake Erie, it could stimulate productivity in addition to other nutrients like nitrogen. But as a geologist, I'm also interested in how this phosphorus cycle has changed throughout Earth's history, because if we think it was a limiting nutrient, it could have had a very strong ability to control or cause some really, really big transitions in Earth's history. It's been hypothesized that that is the case. But we still have actually some big unanswered questions about how phosphorus was behaving through geologic time. And a lot of that actually stems from the fact that a lot of what we know about phosphorus has depended a lot on this sediment sink, so records that are deposited in the ocean, rather than looking at the sediment source itself. And so based, again, primarily on oceans, on records from the ocean, we have linked phosphorus along with weathering intensity to a couple of really big changes in Earth's history. And so I'm going to talk through some of them, not comprehensively, we'd be here for hours now. So, excuse me. So here we have the geologic timescale, which may be a new concept for some of the folks in the talk here. So we think about geologic time in terms of millions of years. So on the left here, this is actually 4 billion years, and then we go all the way up to today. So we're covering a lot of time. And then this lower bar is just this expanded sort of earlier part because there were a lot of biogeochemical transitions basically during this period. So if we're concerned about continental weathering, the first thing that we need is, of course, continents. And we didn't actually have continents for all of Earth's history. So it's debated actually when precisely they emerged or became exposed land above the ocean that could then be weathered. But for the purposes of this talk, we can just assume that they emerged around 3 billion years. And this is important simply because it basically starts providing the sediment supply half of the equation. So once that's been established, we can really start the sediment source to sink movement. And then we've also had a couple of ice ages throughout Earth's history. I just have 2 of them popped up on here. And phosphorus is linked to phosphorus is linked to ice ages really in 2 ways, in sort of a circular way. So you can imagine if you have glaciers, scraping across a continent, they're going to do a lot of erosion. They might increase the volume of sediment that's being moved from continents to the ocean, and therefore increase the amount of phosphorus that's being delivered. Now, when that phosphorus is delivered, again in geologic time, when we think it was a limiting nutrient, it could, just like in Lake Erie, spike the primary productivity or photosynthesis and actually lead to a drawdown of CO2 that causes global cooling. It's basically the opposite of what humans are doing today. And so by causing global cooling, it can facilitate a feedback effect where it cools down, it lets more glaciers grow, it increases erosion, and the cycle continues. And then the sort of counterpart to carbon dioxide decreasing in the atmosphere is oxygen increasing in the atmosphere. And we've had increases in oxygen in the atmosphere in a couple of times throughout Earth's history. Here I just have 2 of sort of the best constrained periods. And the rise of oxygen is important for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is that it allows for a more diverse and expansive biosphere, both on land and in the oceans. And so you might imagine too that once the biosphere expands and you have new critters moving around the ocean floor and plants growing on land, that could be a pretty big perturbation in the phosphorus cycle as well. And the biosphere does include humans. We are a huge perturbation, but I'm not really talking about that today. So these are, again, just some of the big transitions in Earth's history where it's been hypothesized that phosphorus has played a role. And really, phosphorus and weathering intensity are connected in the sense that scientists who are interested in reconstructing these events and thinking about the timing and causes of them have used basically this little dial of weathering intensity on land to control the amount of phosphorus that's being moved around. So if they think there was a relatively low amount of weathering happening on land, you might have a smaller phosphorus flux. If weathering increases, you might have a larger amount of phosphorus being delivered to the oceans, which is sort of a fine assumption, except for the fact that, as I mentioned, a lot of what we know has come from those shale records, and it's much less informed by what's actually happening on land. So this is a really big knowledge gap, and one that a lot of our biogeochemical models for these big events actually hinge upon. And so in my dissertation, as part of it, I aim to really fill in that gap to quantify that sediment source side of things. And that's really what I'll focus on today. So first, I will look at a 3 billion year record of weathering intensity on land. So really filling in the question of what that little dial was doing through time. And then I'll look at how the concentration of phosphorus in soils, this essential nutrient, changed over that same time period. And finally, I'll bring everything back together by looking at those records and looking at them in the context of whether or not they could have contributed to those big transitional events in the way that we traditionally think that they did. Yes, so first we're diving in with weathering. And so here, again, I have geologic time starting with 3 billion years going to the present. And 2 of the gases that are in the atmosphere. The atmosphere has many things in it, but we're focusing on these 2. So as I mentioned previously, atmospheric oxygen has risen generally through time. And the counterpart to that is a decrease in carbon dioxide through time. Now, in addition to influences on things like climate and the biosphere, this would also change the dominant style of weathering on land. So essentially, if you have a really high carbon dioxide atmosphere, you're going to have a lot of carbonic acid available to break down the continent through acidic weathering. Whereas when you shift to having a more oxygen-dominated atmosphere, you start oxidizing the continents. And so you can think about what happens when you leave your car out over a Michigan winter or a Pennsylvania winter for folks hailing from there today. So we might expect to see some big changes accompanying in weathering intensity, accompanying an evolution in atmospheric composition. But there are other factors to consider as well when we're trying to hypothesize how weathering intensity may have changed. If we think about glaciers, glaciers are actually sort of a counterintuitive one, because while they increase probably the amount of erosion, they may have actually led to a decrease in weathering intensity, because if you, as you might imagine, if you have ice sheets sort of covering everything, that's not very conducive for establishing a nice active biosphere that's really actively weathering stuff. So that's debated, so that's sort of one option for how glaciers impacted weathering. And then of course we have the biosphere, which on land is typically thought to have increased over time. And so that would maybe have caused an increase in weathering intensity, as well. And so the big takeaway here is that it's quite confusing, and we don't really have a great handle on how weathering intensity could have changed on land. Luckily, we have an excellent way of figuring that out. Rather than relying only on the sediment sink or shales, we can look at the source in the form of paleosols. And paleosols are fossil soils or lithified soils that, just like any other sort of sediment at Earth's surface, can be lithified and preserved in the rock record over time. And the really cool and sort of important part about this process of soil preservation is that in addition to preserving, maybe some of the physical features, we actually preserve that chemical composition that was recorded when it formed, when it was being actively influenced by all those factors that we talked about. So paleosols in this sense are a really powerful tool, because we can much more directly reconstruct things like weathering intensity and nutrients that were on land through time, more so than shales, which are valuable because shales are basically more common in the rock record. We have more of them and they're preserved more consistently. But because they are this indirect record and they tend to integrate pretty large areas, paleosols are still worth looking at, because they have this rare opportunity for us to quantify what was happening on land and really provide that missing piece of the puzzle. So in order to do this, fill in this missing piece, I, along with the help of some of my amazing undergrads in lab, basically combed through the literature, the paleosol literature, did some quality screening, and built this geochemical database where we compiled geochemistry from over 200 individual fossilized soil profiles spanning about 3 billion years. And this is, to our knowledge, the biggest compilation of paleosol geochemistry to date. Previously, people have used paleosol geochemistry to think about these questions, but basically on smaller scales, so with smaller data sets. So this is a valuable contribution just because we are adding so much richness really to these records that we're interested in. So before we look at some data here, let me orient you. Again, we have geologic time starting at 3.5 billion years going to the present. And I've just thrown up as reminders some bars and sort of images denoting when we might expect to see changes in weathering intensity, again, because of the processes that we talked about. And I've just thrown the dial turned all the way up on the evolution of plants, because the evolution of plants on land in particular has been hypothesized to cause a very dramatic increase in weathering intensity. And this is primarily because plants have evolved roots and really specialized fungi that are super efficient at weathering and breaking down rock to get those nutrients that they need. So this is a place where we might expect to see a big change. And we measure weathering intensity using this quantitative metric that's basically a ratio of elements that tend to be mobilized or moved around during the process of soil formation. So this is a metric that's just based on observations in modern soils. So drum roll, we can look at our data and it looks pretty stable at first glance. So each dot on here is an individual paleosol sample, geochemical point, and the red line is a 400 million year running average. And so again, when we take a first glance at it, it looks like it's pretty stable. I do want to point out there is this in the running average, a potential dip, but because it's really just driven by these two data points in time, we don't interpret that as being significant. It is interesting that it corresponds with a dip in CO2 that's been observed in other records, but we don't, we don't want to interpret this as being significant just on its own. The other thing we see is after plants evolve, we start to see a little bit, it's more common that lower weathering intensities get preserved. And this is, in short, probably due to calcium, due to the evolution of plants, but that's a whole separate bag of worms that I'm happy to talk about if you ask about it later. So that's sort of the big picture, but we want to take a more quantitative look as well, checking whether or not there was a significant change right around this time, so at this big time division between the Precambrian and the Phanerozoic. So now we have weathering intensity is on this, this horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis we have probability. We'll essentially be looking at a histogram. And it is binned by time, right at the, so the orange samples are younger than that line that I popped up before. Purple samples are older. And really the takeaway here is that the distributions in these two times overlap quite strongly. And so we interpret this as meaning that there was not a significant change in weathering intensity over geologic time, and specifically checking at that key sort of hinge point when we might have seen a change. So this is a result that would typically not be expected. There are some camps who think that land plants could have actually decreased weathering intensity, but very few people thought that plants would have no effect on the overall increase, on the overall intensity of weathering. So this is pretty interesting and will lead to some perspective shifts, hopefully. But we never want to rely just on one record to think about something as important as weathering intensity through time. And so we can actually look at some different rocks that represent the continents. And so here I have data from tillites, which are basically ground up sediments from glaciers. And I was interested in looking at these because sort of similar to maybe like a fluvial sandstone that's reflecting a whole watershed, these are integrating a rather large area of sediments that have undergone intensity, that have undergone weathering at Earth's surface. And we have 4 different lines here that are just representing 4 different times in Earth's history. And sort of similar to the histogram that we looked at previously, we don't really see a big shift in any of these. Potentially a shift in this earliest one, but really they are overlapping. And so again, we would interpret this as there not being any big shift in weathering intensity on the continents through time. But we can actually pull in a third record just to check one more time to see if our results are in agreement with other people's. And so here I have, these are data from someone else's study, and they were asking a slightly different question. They were concerned with when a terrestrial biosphere began to be active on land. And to answer that question, they were looking at basically a different metric of weathering intensity that is specifically targeting weathering that's done by organic acids that are exuded by organisms. And so they concluded, similar to our record, that there was no significant change in weathering intensity through time. And the green bars on here are represent two different camps, basically, for when people think a terrestrial biosphere evolved. One is quite early, around 3 billion years, and the other is geologically quite later, between about 800 and 600 million years ago. And so these authors interpreted the consistency of this record as support for early life on land. So that's a pretty interesting implication. And I actually looked at the same metric in our data and found a very similar result, where we don't see a significant change in this weathering metric through time. And so again, this sort of adds to a growing body of evidence for an earlier terrestrial biosphere than previously thought. So if we just revisit those hypotheses that were sort of options for how weathering intensity may have changed, and think about our data, it's pretty different. The record is quite stable on these very long timescales. And certainly we know that there have been shorter term perturbations in weathering intensity from shorter extreme climate events. I don't really have time to get into those, but you can certainly ask me about it later. But this is, maybe just reflecting a long-term stability in all these Earth systems that are affecting continental weathering. So that's great. We've sort of quantified weathering intensity on land through time. That's a big part of that sediment source puzzle. But we still need to think about and quantify what's happening with phosphorus on land over the same time period. And as I mentioned, a lot of what we know about phosphorus comes from the sediment sink, from these shales. And this is an example of such a record, going from, again, oldest to youngest time. And we see there's maybe this increase in range around 650 million years of phosphorus in shales. And this has been of great interest for people who are concerned about biogeochemical cycling in deep time, because there was a lot going on during this time. Among other things, the evolution of complex animals. And so people are really concerned with teasing out the causes and consequences of this apparent increase in phosphorus. But they haven't really considered what's happening on land in a quantitative sense. So I think you can maybe see where this is going if we look at how phosphorus has changed on land through time, again, using that Paleosol record that we compiled, and with these potential time periods of perturbation, we see that the data are pretty consistent again. Certainly, as with the weathering record, there's variability at any given time, but we really don't see those discrete, dramatic state changes that we might be expecting, particularly again, after the evolution of land plants. And so this is, again, contrary to what previous work has really hypothesized. And And so as with weathering intensity, we want to do another check just to see that what we're seeing here is robust. And in particular, one thing that we might be concerned about is the influence of the rock that the soil formed on. Its composition could really strongly affect how much phosphorus is in the soil. So we can check for that and sort of account for that by basically dividing the soil phosphorus by the bedrock phosphorus and sort of checking to see if that results in there being a trend. But again, we see that it's quite stable. So this is just a nice check that it doesn't look like statistically phosphorus on land has changed through time. And this could also be evidence, again, adding to this body of evidence for early life on land, in the sense that some processes, because we see the same range of values that we do in paleosols and modern soils, it could be some additional evidence for a very early, a very early terrestrial biosphere. Okay. And now, like I did sort of in the course of my research, we're going to take a little bit of a tangent. So I mentioned this earlier, and you may have noticed it, but there are some pretty big gaps in a couple of places in these records. And so this prompted a question that I wasn't planning on exploring, but it became really important, really, as I was sort of reaching the end of my dissertation work. And it is, when do we even have paleosols in this record, and why? And so to answer this question, I actually started thinking about the supercontinent cycle, which, if you're not familiar, is really just the process of land masses coming together, assembling supercontinents. Pangaea is the most recent one that we've had, and then breaking back apart. And this might be relevant for paleosols because they form on land, and the supercontinent cycle is a pretty strong control on where we have land masses and how big they are. So understanding this context would be really important for interpreting the geochemical records that we have left in the paleosols that are forming there. And one way that we can quantify the supercontinent cycle through time and sort of track its evolution is using mineral grains called zircons. And these are useful basically because they are super tough, so they don't break down easily. And also because they form during really one phase of that cycle during subduction. And so when we plot the ages of zircons through time, we might expect to see a cyclicity in it that reflects this supercontinent cycle. And indeed, that is what we see. We see peaks and troughs that are pretty, they have a pretty steady frequency that generally overlap with the occurrence of supercontinents. The exact correlation between whether the peaks correspond with supercontinent assembly or breakup remains debated, but that's sort of a nuanced point that we don't need to get into for this. So the interesting thing is when we start looking at, if we overlay the occurrence of paleosols with zircons in this record, paleosols here are in the orange line. And overall, the peaks in paleosols typically line up with the peaks in zircons in a qualitative sense, with two notable exceptions. One, which I labeled here, is that first occurrence of a rise in oxygen in the atmosphere. And here I think we have a great example actually of oversampling, because this is a period of great interest in the paleosol community. We have a lot of samples from this period. And so that I think is why we have this mismatch. And then the other sort of mismatch is towards the present, where we have an increase in paleosol preservation, essentially. And this we can attribute most likely to a simple recency bias, where if rocks are younger, they are more likely to still be around. And that's a problem that almost all geologic records face. We see this pattern in a lot of different different rock records, both from the terrestrial and marine. So this in itself is sort of an interesting observation and one that makes sense. Paleosols form on land, supercontinents are a lot of land, so they happen to occur during the supercontinent cycle. So what? But it starts to have some important implications when we think about all the different types of bias that might go into creating the Paleosol record that we have. So if you think about the country today, you know, even just driving from Michigan to the West Coast, we go through an enormous amount of climatic and environmental variability. The same would be true, and maybe even exaggerated, on a supercontinent. And so if we have paleosols that are, for example, more likely to be formed on the wet side of that continent, more likely to be preserved in a basin with active rivers, more likely to be forming and preserving during, you know, the assembly part of a supercontinent cycle rather than the breakup. These could all lead to systematic biases in the geochemical record that we're actually seeing. And this is sort of these are important things to consider, but because people haven't really been using these very long-term paleosol records as much as maybe we've used other types of rock records, they haven't been considered as widely. And so I don't have any easy answers for this at this point. It's just sort of a really important consideration going forward. And here I want to also raise the importance of, you know, this is a compilation that I, along with some undergrads, put together over a couple of years. It is not comprehensive of all the paleosols that exist. And so this provides a great opportunity for basically the community to collaborate and build a really, really rich database where we could start to fill in maybe some of these gaps and check to see in a quantitative way if any of these, you know, depositional environments or soil formation environments would have a systemic bias. So these are just some new interesting points to consider going forward. Okay, and now we can start to put everything back together as I wrap up here. So we can revisit our two big records that are filling in the sediment source side of the puzzle. And so contrary to a lot of hypotheses, we didn't see a big dramatic change in weathering intensity or in phosphorus through time in these terrestrial landscapes. And again, it's possible that we know there are shorter perturbations, but they're not captured by this, or they're not reflected obviously in this record. They are in here, they're just all hidden in all these little dots that we have towards the present. And so one of the takeaways is, you know, if you're looking to consider a short-term perturbation, you definitely have to zoom in terms of time. And it's also really important to establish regional context for the record that you're looking at, so you can get a sense of this background variability and tease out the important information in a more confident way. An additional interpretation of these records and their stability, it could be a sort of natural tendency for Earth systems together to return to a baseline after some perturbation. So we see, for example, we have this big gap when there was a snowball Earth. But before and after that, this big gap, it looks pretty consistent. And so we might imagine, again, thinking about all those factors, if one changes, for example, if there's a change in the atmosphere and there's a corresponding change in the climate that causes, you know, a snowball Earth, eventually those come to some sort of equilibrium and balance back out. We are not still in snowball Earth. And so that's just one sort of additional lens through which we can look at the stability in these records. Just highlighting again the importance of considering these potential biases in the Paleosol record as we really begin to fill in this data set. And then the other sort of important implication is the fact that these Paleosols, this critical record of what's happening on land, can serve as an additional line of evidence for an early terrestrial biosphere. And now we can really put it all together. We've got the stability of the records, we've got some biases to consider, we maybe have a terrestrial biosphere through a lot of Earth's history. And so did these changes in weathering intensity and phosphorus control some of these big biogeochemical transitions in the way that people hypothesized that they would? Well, if the records are stable on these really long-term timescales that we use for modeling these events, I think we have to revisit our reliance on this little dial of weathering intensity and using that as a control for phosphorus delivery. That being said, it's not all bad news. There are other things happening on Earth. So one of the big controls, I think, would be just the area of land that we have exposed at any given time, because that sort of sets the baseline for how much, for the volume of sediments that could be generated and moved. In addition to changes in the area of land, we would also want to consider where they're positioned on the globe. If you think about a supercontinent that's positioned primarily over the equator, where we might have tropical environments with really intense weathering, those paleosols or paleosols formed on that continent would have a really different chemical signature on average than if they formed on a supercontinent that was mostly on the poles, which I don't think has happened, but it could, because those would have a much lower weathering intensity. So that's something to consider as well. Changes in erosion would certainly drive, that's sort of the baseline mechanism for changes in phosphorus delivery. And then I want to end on the biosphere, because I think it's probably the most important part of this this work in some ways. Although a lot of focus has been placed on weathering intensity on land, equally important is how the marine biosphere uses those nutrients once they're delivered. And the efficiency of their nutrient use has evolved through time. It's improved through time. So today, the marine biosphere can do a lot more with phosphorus than it could 600 million years ago. It gets a lot more bang for its buck. So I want to end really on highlighting the importance of this idea of nutrient use efficiency in being a controlling factor in these big important biogeochemical transitions. End of science. And I want to thank people who put questions in the chat. I have a couple there that I'll answer after I do my acknowledgements, and I try not to cry too much. So this was not planned. I didn't know what Nathan was going to say, but this is Nathan in the Faroe Islands, which I also thought was a really fun trip, both in terms of like neat science that we were thinking about. And it was just, we got to hang out in the Faroes for a week or so. Despite the fog, it was beautiful. So this is Nathan after he got completely drenched by a very cold wave trying to get a great Instagrammable picture of this nice little promontory. These are the shots from those tunnels that he was talking about. I think we traded that day. He had to drive through the tunnels, but I think I would make dinner and do the dishes, so because I really did not want to drive through those. And then this is the carrot cake that he was talking about. So like, we're really on the same page. Yeah, I alluded to it before, but Nathan has really been just like one of the best advisors I think you could ask for. He's really open, he's really chill, which I really appreciate. And like I said at the beginning, especially later, in the last, 3 years or so of grad school, I really felt like I could come to him as a colleague with ideas, and I always felt like my ideas were respected. Unfortunately, that's not always the case in academia. And I learned really later on to just never take that for granted. He and Selena put on great, he's very good at cooking. So it's been a pleasure being in his lab for sure. Yes. Even if he does mock me for my lack of pop culture knowledge, I have watched Star Trek Next Generation by now. Okay, so I also want to acknowledge the other members of my committee who I really appreciate, because when I made the committee, I thought my dissertation was going to be pretty different than what it ended up being. I thought I was going to focus on iron and redox, and it's really shifted. So they've been just great and supportive throughout that process, and I've really valued their input. Yeah, it's been really great having their perspective on things. I also want to thank Naomi, who I've worked with now for a couple of years as GSM. She cares so much about the department and supporting grad students. And it's great to work with her. Actually, this is a plug because she is looking for new GSMs for next year. So talk to her or talk to me or Madeline or Marlon if you're interested. I also want to thank Selena, Jenna, and Sierra for just being great supportive members of the department who I've come to for advice at different points in time. I want to thank people who I've taught with, so Nathan, John, Marin, Becky, and Adam. I also want to thank Eric Hedlund, who in his data and models class, that's actually the first time I started looking at the changes in phosphorus through time. And then I also want to thank some funding sources and USDA for providing soil samples, and the Association for Women in Science for providing a great community here on campus. Shout out to Lola for being the best camp dog. I want to thank, oh boy, here we go. Oh no, I want to thank all the undergrads in lab. I worked with a lot of great students over the years, and these are just the students who I worked with most directly. There were lots of undergrads always coming through our lab, and that's actually one of the things that I liked about it. The lab group as a whole, as Nathan was sort of talking about, it's just been such a great, like, collaborative, supportive, and open environment, and hopefully we've, extended that to the undergrads as well. Katie finished her senior thesis last year, and pictured here is her we did some field work out in Utah, where I accidentally made a dry ice bomb. That's a different story. But she finished her senior thesis and is working at the USGS out in Washington. And then Sonia just finished her senior thesis and is starting at the University of Vermont as a master's student in the fall. So I'm really proud of all of them, and I'm just, working with them was just definitely the bright spot in my day, for both when we were in person in lab and also, meeting with Sonia over the pandemic, when we were in this great parallel spot of, like, we're both trying to finish in a pandemic, so how can we make it work? So big thanks to all of them. I have been in this department for so long. I have so many people to thank. This is in no way, everyone who I need to thank, but oh boy. I want to thank Katie for being so amazing. Really, Katie was just starting out in lab, I think, when I was working there as an undergrad, and she just was always really accessible and also just, like, fun to talk to about science. And then she made me feel always welcome and always like I could do science if I wanted to. And so she was a big part, I think, of why I decided to go to grad school in the first place. Oh no, where are my tissues? And so, and once I was in grad school, she, along with other people, but really Katie, just set a great example for caring about the science, but not letting it take over your life, and just leading a great, like, happy, balanced life as a grad student. And I always liked being able to talk to her about, whatever science or just life stuff was going on. So she was great. I've also had amazing, like, everyone who's in the lab previously. I forgot to put Becca as a past lab mate because I still haven't processed that you're gone, I guess. I had, a lot of previous grad students in the department, some of whom I had, like, as GSIs for undergrad. I definitely remember I had Alex Ty for structure, and I would just, like, when we would talk about structure as grad students, I was just like, I can't look at you in the eye. You saw my undergrad labs. So a lot of excellent people in the department doing field work with Emily, Tim Stahl, who's gone, but who led the New Zealand field trip. Everyone in my cohort was so amazing. I feel so lucky to have gotten to know so many of you who are just so smart and accomplished and supportive and wonderful. And then especially the folks who I've served with as GSMs. So Madeline and Marlon this year. Oh, Phoebe, I'm sorry. I forgot your name. I put Madeline twice. Anyway, So working with them has been really amazing. I've had some adopted very close friends, or I have very close friends in my adopted other lab, which is the Stale or Scale lab. Billy and Kirk are my lab away from lab, because they're great friends, and I definitely wouldn't have gotten through grad school as well as I have without them. Plus, I can talk to them about geomorphology and stuff, so it works out. Big thanks to, I don't even know how to, I acknowledge Becca for being just the best, lab mate through all of this, and it's fun to have somebody with the same name. We had a great time doing fieldwork together. This was, I think, our Memorial Day party for lunch out in the middle of Wyoming. So it was great working with her. And then big thanks to my friends, Camille and Brittany and Caitlin, who's I couldn't find a picture, but I've been friends with them since high school. They were all in grad school and have just been so supportive. Big thanks to my cats. I almost added some chocolate on here because Nathan was not joking. This dissertation was powered by Haagen-Dazs, but my cats are great, even if they're mostly annoying. Okay, I need tissues now for this next one for sure. Oh no. My grandparents aren't here today. I know they would be really happy. Sorry. They were always just so, they were so proud of all of us. And they were just always, really encouraging us to push ourselves and to focus on education, and be, especially I have a lot of girl cousins, and so, they were always pushing us to be strong, independent women. My grandma did eventually accept the fact that I was not going to business school to go into finance. But so they were all four of them just really supportive and loving. And this is my grandpa on my dad's side, and he actually had a PhD in physical chemistry and worked on the first nuclear submarine in the US, I think. And he actually picked up geology late in life. He sort of discovered it and became a really active citizen geologist. That's not quite the right word, because he ended up writing, I think, 2 600-page textbooks about Western Pennsylvania geology. And he also, taught some classes, I think, at a community college. So I know he would be just really happy to see where I am today. I have his rock hammer in my office here. And then my grandma also, she always wanted me to write a book. Now I have. I don't think it's quite the book that she maybe expected me to write, but I know that both of them and all my grandparents really would be really happy to see that I'm combining writing and science and where I'm going next. This is her actually helping me edit the terrible novel I wrote in high school. Do not ask me about that. And then I also just want to thank my whole extended family. This isn't even all of my cousins. It's just such a great, fun family to be in, and they're all really supportive. Special shout out to my cousin Rachel, who is the other R. Dzombak. It won't be confusing at all, I'm sure. And my Uncle Dave, who is a professor in civil engineering. Dave and especially Rachel have been just so supportive as I finished my PhD. Sorry, I know these are long acknowledgements. Thanks to my siblings. I don't know how to thank you for just being the most fun people to hang out with. Izzy, I found this picture of us from the 90s, and I really think we need to get this vibe going again. And I also want to thank your, Anna and Tu, who are your amazing partners, who I've gotten to know and, love them so much. And Lulu the dog, who just looks amazing in tweed. So thanks to you guys for always being great. I want to thank Nick's family, his whole crazy extended family, but really thanks to his mom, Lori, and his dad, Svein. I've got to know them over the last 4, almost 5 years. And they have just, I feel so loved and supported and welcomed by them. And they've been great, especially in the last couple of months as I'm pushing towards the finish line here, reminding me to go out for a walk. You need to cook real dinner sometimes. So just a big thanks and love to them for everything they've done for both me and Nick. And thanks to, their partners and everyone, whoever's watching in Norway. I want to thank my parents who always supported and encouraged me, and because of how they raised me and the values that they instilled in me, and the models that they presented for me growing up, especially, well, both of them, there was just nothing that I felt like I couldn't do. I never felt discouraged from pursuing math or science. They supported me in anything that I wanted to do. Even now, when I'm finishing my PhD and I'm like, I'm gonna go be a writer, they seem to be supportive. So I can never appreciate them enough. And there's, nothing I can say to thank them enough for everything that they've done to get me to where I am today. And then last, I promise, I want to thank Nick, who a lot of you know. He's pretty great. He has been so supportive through all of grad school, and we just have excellent conversations about science and grad school and life, and being with him throughout this time has been really amazing. So thanks to Nick. Okay. That's the end of my acknowledgements. I did some fun calculations here about, I've had a really good time in grad school. And I feel really, really, I don't know, honored and grateful to have been a part of the community that I have. And so with that, I am happy and eager to take your questions. And I can go back and look through to see if I've missed any. Nathan, do you want to go through and look for questions or moderate?
Let's apply first.
Yay!
Sorry, my acknowledgements were so long. Okay, Madeline, I see your hand is up.
Cool. Great talk, Becca. Thank you so much. I just have one quick question. First was, in your weathering metric, what are the mobile elements that you measure?
Yeah, so it is aluminum, calcium, sodium, and potassium. And we actually looked at some other metrics as well that also consider iron and manganese for more mafic paramaterials.
Cool. Okay, thanks. And then I had one other question. You mentioned that certain soil formation types, preservation environments, and potentially supercontinent configurations could bias the paleosoil samples. What, and for your source kind of samples, but what do you think could bias or influence the shale or sink side of the equation?
Great question. So I think some of the main biases that we are concerned with around shales would maybe be redox differences between basins. I didn't mention it, but a big, another sort of big concern with using shales globally is relying maybe too much on the assumption that what's recorded in a single basin in the ocean is reflective of, the whole water column or the whole ocean. So I think that would be one bias. I'm not sure about biases in the shale record more related to like tectonic evolution and delivery of sediments. There is actually an interesting paper that tries to map out passive margin length through time. It works somewhat well, but I think the passive margin length would be a big control on whether or not we have a decent shale record for a period of time.
So Becca, we'll go back up to a couple from the chat from your family. I'm going to put them together. So one of the questions had to do with if you plotted the data on an arithmetic scale instead of on a log scale, would you have seen any other trends? And then the other question was just about, sort of how did you pick the 400 million year window for thinking about weather?
Okay, yeah. So I'll answer I don't think I put any of the log comparison plots in my extra slides, but that's a great question. So I chose log because there is a pretty big range in values for phosphorus, especially in the modern. We have some very some soils with very, very high phosphorus values. So this is really just to compare. But short answer is no, that you don't really see a difference in trends. I chose log really just for visualization purposes. And then, the 400 million year time window for the running average was really picked to try to accommodate these largest gaps. And really, as we move to trying smaller and smaller windows, because of the sampling frequency, basically, it just became, pinging from point to point. And so I chose a very long window, to account for the gaps and to try to avoid over visualizing change. Yeah.
Then Joel has his hand up.
Yeah, Joel.
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk. Nice talk. I have a question. You based a lot of your study on the chemical index of alteration, which is a measure of weathering intensity, but not weathering rate. And to get rate, I guess you would need to look at the thickness of soil formation as a function of time, as well as the chemical index of alteration. Is it possible that weathering rate might show trends, and that's being obscured because you're using the weathering intensity instead?
Yeah, that is a great point. And so I actually, do I have it in here? I actually did think about the thickness of the profiles that we were using, in part to check whether there was any systemic, increase or decrease in thickness through time, which we didn't find. I didn't try correlating profile thickness and weathering intensity to estimate a rate, but that could be a very interesting point to include going further.
Can I sneak in one other question?
Yeah.
Sorry, you talked about well, I'm just curious what the fossil record is of terrestrial bacteria and fungi and whatnot, earlier than the colonization of the continents by trees.
In a word, I would say sparse, but it is there. So some of the earliest records that we have are really based on, do I have those pictures? It's a combination of fluvial stromatolites, so microbial structures, as well as smaller scale preserved microbial mats, the earliest of which we have from about 3.2 billion years. But it is certainly much more sparse than even the microfossil record moving into the Neoproterozoic. The fungal record the fossil record of fungi is interesting. Really, those don't crop up until I think the earliest one now is about 1 billion years. That's maybe putative. But I know there's some research actually looking into focusing on fossilized fungi in basalts as a potential source of very early colonization. That is, I would definitely say, more up in the air.
Thank you.
Yeah. Uncle Dave.
Well done, Becca. My question relates to the mobility of phosphorus. So phosphorus in water, in contact with clays or many kinds of oxidic minerals, adheres very strongly to the surfaces of those minerals, and thus is very strongly associated with the solid phase. In fact, its solubility is severely limited by that. So my question is, I was particularly intrigued by the hypothesis that you described related to the ice ages, and the hypothesis that you mobilize the sediment, you spike the primary productivity, it reduces CO2 in the atmosphere. All that really is strongly dependent on the water chemistry. So both for that hypothesis and for your own work, where does the water chemistry come in? And maybe phosphorus is just an excellent tracker of sediment movement from source to sink, as you described. You couldn't do it with nitrogen. It is much too mobile in the environment, but phosphorus is an excellent tracker of sediments. So how does the water chemistry and the mobility or immobility of phosphorus come into that hypothesis and into your own work?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So in this work, I was in the process of exploring phosphorus speciation actually when the pandemic hit. I think all those notes are still on the whiteboard in lab. So that's something that I was sort of bummed that I didn't get around to. In terms of phosphorus mobility during Ice Age specifically, and thinking about spikes in productivity, I know that phosphorus and its tendency to absorb to iron in particular in the oceans has been that scavenging can be a limitation in the bioavailability of phosphorus. And that can also be mediated by things like calcium, magnesium, and silica, which would also presumably be coming out in those glacial fluxes. So I'm not really sure about how that interplay would work out in terms of quantifying how, for however much phosphorus is delivered, how much productivity it would spike. And this is a pretty interesting point because another sort of limitation in our thinking about these processes on deep time scales is that they are typically not too informed by modern studies of weathering in glacial environments. This is something that I've thought about a little bit. I read some papers for this part of this chapter, and there are a couple of studies that sort of think about it in trying to quantify the time scale of phosphorus release from glaciation, but they haven't really attempted to look at it in the nuanced way that you're talking about. I think that's sort of a hand wavy answer way of saying that is not something that's really considered too much.
It's for future work.
It is, and
you can delve in.
Yeah, when I was still thinking about doing postdocs, I actually spoke with some people down in Florida who Mark Robbins in our department worked with previously. So it's coming down the pipeline, and I'll keep an eye on it even from the sidelines, I think, because I think that would be a really good way to improve the field.
Well done, thank you.
Okay, thanks for all of the questions. We should let everybody move on with their day now and also get to the private part with the committee. But if everyone wants to unmute, and we can see if we can applaud for Becca one more time.
Anyway, thanks again, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate everyone being here.
You're welcome back.
Bye, Becca.
Bye.
Bye, Beth.
Hi, Becca.
Bye. See you guys
Bye,
later.
Becca.
Congratulations.
For the committee members, why don't we all take a quick 5-minute break, and then we can go back to the other Zoom link that I sent out to all of you this morning.